that's come out of it is about American empire. It's in the sense of Hart and Negri, American empire is an epistemological empire as well as a capitalist one, obviously. It's about the insidious power of the American dream, the linear conception of immigration to citizenship, or notions of integration as the progressive striving for unity from diversity, as something at the core of an ongoing neocolonial and neoliberal racial capitalism, to give it kind of the big kind of slogan that I develop in the paper, and how this has become, how the American kind of framing of these kinds of notions has become the dominant form of progressive nationalism in Western Europe, has become or is becoming across the continent, and how it's reproduced through a particular normal science of immigrant integration, and the policy formulations of international institutions of migration and development is a global model of immigration, integration, citizenship that I'm critiquing. And I argue that it's how the post-colonial nation state in what I call the North Atlantic West has hung on to its colonial power status in a post-colonial era, effectively, and continues how it uses a particular sort of production of immigrant integration and the diversity that it processes as a way of rolling out the standard modernist development paradigm that we're familiar with in the post-war era. And of course, the problematics of which you all know very well at your project with the work of authors such as Arturo Escobar and so on. So why integration? And the book starts with this image. I'm sure you've all seen this film before, La Bataille d'Alger, 1966. If you haven't seen this film, go watch it online immediately afterwards. You need to watch it. And it's the very first scene in the film where soldiers are dressing up an old Algerian man during the Algerian War of Independence as a French soldier. And they laugh and cackle at him as they shove a hat on his head as a French soldier, and they say intégration, kind of putting the hat on his head. And this is integration as torture, bullying, humiliation, and compliance. And I argue it's the core of colonial practice, effectively. And the book is about the continuity, in many ways, it's about the continuity of this image with this one, which is an image, of course, of an integrated French football team triumphing in the World Cup of 1998 and 2018, and why essentially these two images are the same image in a certain way. And I'm going to give you clues, obviously, to this argument as I go through, but we'll get time to discuss all of this, I hope. Now, the paper circulated continues the argument by looking for theoretical resources for this critical exercise in both the older mainstream migration studies and a newer critical migration and mobility studies. And hence, Ari Zolberg is a key part of this argument. And this is kind of how I see myself in all of this. I am, known, I suppose, as a kind of mainstream migration studies person. I'm an old school mainstream scientist working for the empire in some sense, but trying to plant a destructive code at the heart of the Death Star in which we all live and work. And these are the critical guys that I'm bringing together with my argument. Of a mostly younger generation, a motley crew of gender, anti-racist, decolonial theorists and activists who share the same goal as me, but have not yet worked out how to do it. So I'm presenting the elements, effectively, of a new critical political demography as an attempt to spell out this code, this destructive code, to put it very, very briefly as a kind of, as a joke. So I present the elements of the critical political geography here. We don't need to go through this in any detail at all, as Anne will pick this up. And the GEMS article is online, open access and so forth. I just want to reel off the basic points just so that we've got the kind of key points in our minds. And the first point, I've already gone through it, the integration nation as a linear conception of immigration, integration, and citizenship. It's the American dream as a formation of a certain sort of empire that is shaping Western notions of immigrant diversity. The second point comes, the migration and mobilities continuum, comes from the influence of mobilities studies, the scholarship which I share with Anne in some ways, beyond migration studies as such, in which the power of immigration as such and the designation of migrants is how it gets distinguished from not only what is illegal, what we consider illegal movement across borders, but also all kinds of other banal and everyday mobilities that happen within a globally integrated world. And the analysis of these processes of state designation at the borders is how, and the power that it generates is effectively what political demography is all about. The making legible, the bordering, making invisible migrants and also minorities. So the politics of immigration is very much bound up with the politics of race in the argument I present. The third point, obviously, integration as a notion is about the production of an individualistic citizenship, idealized citizens that are the production of a modern development kind of dynamic. But it's also, of course, clearly a kind of governmentality. It's a governmentality that works both at the border and within society to select and extract certain sorts of people and keep others out, emancipating some and consigning others to a certain sort of waste outside of it. In other words, the kinds of biopolitics and necropolitics that have been focused on in a lot of border studies. The fourth point, I think, perhaps raises a particularly a somewhat uncomfortable point, perhaps, about a shift that we've seen in recent period in the focus of integration nations from selective economic migration to a kind of selective and discriminatory humanitarian migration at the core of discussions of integration. Particularly this is the case in a lot of the current research on integration in the post-refugee crisis period in Europe, where I think that a look at it reveals in some sense who the truly subaltern are, i.e. those still left behind and left out by ongoing extractive processes that are being kind of indicated by these integration processes. And then the fifth point is a point really about the sources of alternatives, obviously, to this. An assessment, first of all, of the failures of the transnationalist literature to maintain its transformative emphasis, as it originally had at the beginning, and a need to really stress the importance of alternate politics as disintegrative politics that disrupt the order of global inequalities, that can only be assessed in some sense as radical politics when they change the status and life chances of those left behind and left out, those who fundamentally cannot move mostly. And I bring in arguments here about migration as decolonization, and I suggest a couple of lines I think where we might want to talk about this. One is, I think, about the ongoing instrumentalization of citizenship, devaluing Western citizenship in the global hierarchies of citizenship. Second is the exploitation of benefits and economic opportunities as a kind of reparations in certain sorts of migrant systems. And thirdly, the relationship of these ongoing migrations to transnational solidarity movements that might also be trans-class in some ways. Black Lives Matter being one example, perhaps in certain contexts, political Islam. And the final point of discussion I think we might want to get to is, of course, the impact of COVID-19. The renationalization is obvious. The enhancement of state powers at border and the way in which states have been able to penetrate both society and especially bodies through revived notions of public health. And I think what we will see as its legacy, and something that, again, we can discuss in a lot more detail, is that the racial capitalism that we're talking about will become increasingly biometric and eugenic in its properties in the future era, which indeed may be a kind of post-neoliberal era in that case. And I'll stop there.
Now with the comments from Professor McNevin.
Thanks, Jose. Thanks, Adrian, for the really provocative touch points, not just of your paper, but also of your book, which I haven't read yet, but I'm very much looking forward to seeing. So hello to everyone out there. I see many names behind the camera that I recognize, a lot that I don't. I guess, Adrian, I just want to start by saying what I really appreciate about the article you circulated is that it's really, it's 20 odd pages, but it's also really, comes as a result of decades of reflection, I think, upon migration studies as a field, and decades of participation, your own participation in these debates. And so it's really an incredible synthesis of the field that was very clarifying and generative for me. And I think it asks some really hard questions about the purpose and direction of a field as a whole. And I think that kind of, meta reflection seems incredibly important at a time when it's very easy to despair about the state of migration. And when we have to think somewhat strategically, I guess, about intellectual divisions as much as political ones. So I really appreciate the sort of ambition and demands that you're making in the paper. And there's a lot in it that I'm very much on board with. At the most general level, to refuse the givenness of this immigration, integration, citizenship trio as a kind of default frame for migration studies, but also probing the fact of its tenacity, right? The fact that it remains so strong as a starting point for scholarly inquiry and governmental projects more often than not. So making the givenness of all of that an object of inquiry in itself. And so, as you said, you want to bring the insights of an earlier generation of scholars, people like Zolberg, Holyfield, Brubaker in particular, who I think, I take you to be saying were in their own ways focused on what we might now call bordering practices. That were and are, in their take as well, fundamental to certain states and to state system. And to bring those together with the insights of certain kinds of critical migration scholars drawing on the autonomy of migration and the acts of citizenship literature. And then against the impulse, or perhaps in addition to the impulse of many critical scholars to emphasize the perspective from the margins or from the global south and from the point of view, say, of the illegalized, you suggest that we still need to focus on the production of national populations at the imperial center, or what you call the North Atlantic West. Because that tells us something about how and why this immigration, integration, citizenship trio remains so powerful. And crucially, it tells us something also about the relationship between that trio and, old and new and changing forms of global order around mobility that others have, characterized as a kind of global apartheid. And I think the centrality of those things, this sort of nationally framed project of integration and this maintenance of a global order, it was clearer, I think, from the comments you've just made. So I guess the way I read this is in some ways and in keeping with the spirit of the critique of methodological nationalism. And so often when that critique is cited, people emphasize only one side of it. And that's that we should refuse to take the nation and the state as the unquestioned starting points for thinking about migration. But of course, the critique was also about submitting the nation and the state to scrutiny, right? Asking how they got to become the unquestioned parameters for migration, and continuing to ask about the political work that nation and state do. So I understand your project as, in some ways, re-emphasizing that second dimension of that critique and bringing it into relation with this, this morphing form of global order around mobility. So to do this, you argue for more attention to elite forms of mobility, why they are invisible in the sense that they don't register as migration at all, or not always. And so there's overlap here, for instance, with the sort of growing attention to investor citizenship that Eilert Sachar and amongst others is looking at. You also argue for more attention to those who are legally present, and you use the phrase not needing to be integrated. And use that phrase obviously in a particular way. And so there's overlap here, I think, with those that Engen Isen might call imminent outsiders. And there's overlap with what Mesadra and Nielsen would call a process of differential inclusion, including this kind of proliferation of visa classes for temporary migrants, how all of this intersects with a kind of just in time and to the point production process, and how all of this lands with the sort of transformations in global political economy and, as you say, with racial capitalism. So I think you're right that there's a convergence of scholarship arguing that we need to see all of these groups, you know, from the ultra marginalized to the ultra elite in relation to each other and to global forms of power. And so I see your project working very much in that spirit. And as you mentioned in your comments, you also draw on Tende Achume's project for migration as decolonization. And you mentioned that, I think, in particular, because she addresses very explicitly economic migration from the global south to the global north in particular. So she's working at the level of a global mobility order, without, however, falling into the trap that you see other kinds of critical scholars falling into, also, as you mentioned in your comments, where their efforts to defend asylum seekers ends up buying into the demonization of everyone else as economic migrants, and whereby the push to open borders for asylum seekers does nothing to address the immobilization of those who are unable to make it to the border of the north in order to make that claim in the first place. So I want to think just for a few minutes with Achume's argument, because I think doing so might get at some of what I thought might still be missing from the project for a new political demography. So I guess my comments are more in the vein of how we might push your project further than even further than it already goes. So for those in the audience who are not familiar with Achume's 29 article, Migration as Decolonization, she makes the case that formerly colonized third world peoples, and that's the language she uses, that third world peoples ought to have the right to first world citizenship, that is, to migrate to the global north and to full membership within it, and that they should have this right on account of their co-membership in an enduring imperial formation. So she argues that ongoing forms of colonialism have prevented substantive, meaningful forms of self-determination in post-colonial states, and that the relevant polity we should be looking at is not the nation state so much, but an imperial assemblage. And within that polity, she argues that third world peoples are equal co-members with first world peoples, but it's the first world that's siphoned off the wealth and privilege and the citizenship rights. And so then from this perspective, it becomes a matter of fair distribution and reconceptualized as equal members of this polity. There's firstly no legitimate reason to contain the mobility of one set of people and to facilitate the mobility of the other. But more importantly, mobility from the third world to the first becomes part of a claim for reparations for the systematic disadvantage and against third world peoples across this history of colonialism. So on one hand, she gives this fantastic diagnosis of the way colonialism continues to structure a form of global apartheid with respect to human mobility. And this takes the form of this passport power that, Adrian, you talk about in your article. But her solution, I think, at least in my view, reaches a kind of limit insofar as it's a politics of redistribution rather than transformation. So first world citizenship as it is becomes available to post-colonial populations. So there's a sense in which what she's proposing remains an incorporative, integrative project, albeit on a global scale. So she does address the immobilization of those groups who can't get to the borders of the North in order to claim asylum. And that group is also your concern, Adrian. She doesn't offer much to those post-colonial populations who might prefer to stay at home under conditions that make it viable to do so. She also doesn't address the settler colonial condition. So she doesn't address the ways in which her proposal would compel sovereign states in the global North to open borders to certain post-colonial populations without thought to the fact that the sovereign power to do so is also contested by Indigenous peoples in the global North. So one question to you would be about what remains, I think, an awkward tension, if not a silence, in much migration studies, including critical studies oriented towards open borders and decolonised borders on the matter of Indigenous sovereignties. So I wonder where that question fits into your project. There seems to me plenty of scope to fit it in from this perspective of imminent outsiders, from the perspective of the relationship between the settler colonial project and this kind of global order of mobility and immobility, but you don't express it, you don't address it explicitly, and so I'm wondering how you might approach that set of relations. The second question I had was on what you call disintegrative processes. And I really like this term because it can be read in multiple ways. And I wonder if it could be pushed to do even more work in your project. So I think it can be taken firstly to signal the state's projects of denationalisation, of internal divisions and differentiation of populations, whether by race, gender, indigeneity, and as you point out, increasingly by these different types of migration status. I also think it can signal, this disintegrative processes can signal the division and differentiation of state space. So the division of bounded territories. So here we could think of things like special economic zones, tax havens, offshore finance, and so on. So those kinds of disintegrative projects become more obvious to us in an age of globalization. But it's also something that's been with states from the start in the principle of extraterritoriality. So this disintegrative process seems to run in parallel with an integrative one. And I wonder if seeing the two rather as sort of counterposed forces, whether they can be investigated as part of kind of a complementary technologies that reproduce this immigration, citizenship, integration trio, albeit in quite counterintuitive ways. So I'm thinking, for example, so if you think of these two as sort of complementary rather than opposing, I'm thinking, for example, of the use of extraterritorial logics in the very implementation of border control itself, with offshore detention as an example there. So I think then the term disintegration or disintegrative politics processes can also be read in terms of a politics of refusal. And you touch on this as well. So when migrants or disenfranchised minorities or Indigenous peoples refuse to get on board with an integration project. So what might be investigated here is not just the refusal itself, but also the kinds of projects that those specific groups initiate instead. Not because they'll necessarily give us some kind of prescriptive recipe for migration done differently. They may not address migration explicitly at all, but because they might reveal other political grammars that are not premised on the immigration, integration, citizenship model. So I'm thinking, for instance, I mean, I think you're signaling some of this in your comments. You talked about the connections with the movement for Black Lives, and there would be many other examples we could think of. But I'm thinking as well, and this I guess relates to my earlier question, about Indigenous conceptions of sovereignty that aren't reducible to exclusive proprietorial forms that underwrite state sovereignty and border controls themselves. So how are they being mobilised for concrete political projects, certainly concerning Indigenous people, but perhaps even more broadly than that, and that ways that might produce, counterintuitive starting points for thinking about mobility. I guess I'm also thinking of historical examples we might draw on here, and some things that might interest this audience, the kinds of forms of anti-colonial politics that circulated perhaps prior to the uptake of the post-colonial state as the sort of default model for independence. So I wonder then whether there's a kind of partner project or a complementary project to your political demography, in which we look not only beyond the abject migrant, but also beyond migration as such, as a basis from which to both critique and imagine alternatives of political association. So this is not to say for a second that, it's on you to do all of this, more to make the point that if migration studies is to maintain a critical distance from the immigration, integration, citizenship frame for human mobility, it might also need to be in conversation with political claims in which migration, at least as the sort of conceptual framing for mobility, where that may not figure centrally at all. So I guess what I'm saying is that I think there's ways in which your project could be stretched in both directions. So deeper into the processes of state transformation that counterintuitively shore up this trio, and then deeper beyond a wider range of migrants to a wider range of subjects more generally, who are trying to recast the terms of political association, the nature of polities through which we might think human mobility. So I think it's hugely sort of generative and productive what you're sort of proposing, and so I've taken it sort of I guess I'm curious to see how you whether the attempt to even push it further makes sense to you and to others in the room. So I'll stop there and over to Jose for discussion.
Yeah, Adrian, want to add anything before?
So what's your usual format here? I'm happy to go with whatever you prefer.
Usually we open the room and the participants raise their
because you've read my
hands.
paper, you've heard comments. Maybe we could hear some more responses, and I'll try to do my best to synthesize and get back to some of the key points that was made.
So anyone who have any comment or question can raise their yellow hand. Yeah, Phil.
Hi, thanks for provocative presentation and excellent commentary from Professor McNevin. I haven't read the paper, so I can't really grapple with it as much as I'd like, but I'll try to maybe channel a Zolbergian kind of response or reaction. And that's to say that what do we lose when we start talking about human mobility in place of international migration? I think if you read so many of Ari's essays, they begin with a sentence that's roughly the same. It's the division of the world into sovereign nation states that gives human mobility its very peculiar, highly charged and political character, right? His phenomenology of international migration is all about the nation state, all about borders, and all about the sorts of political reactions that that form of political organization generates. And I think what made him so special is that he did this while being always highly critical of that same set of structures, right? So in no way did he, I mean, he used to say this petri dish idea of the world where nation states are divided and they sort of have social cohesion, and he never bought into that. And whether you were at a casual dinner or in a seminar, I mean, this was one of the things he attacked. So it's not a question of being critical, but really it's a question of what you base your critique in. And I wonder whether the shift away, the sort of, you know, a very one-sided reading of the methodological nationalism argument leads us to miss some very peculiar and special characteristics of international migration from which we can build very strong critiques, and not to subsume international migration into human mobility, which most of the time is banal. That's a wonderful word, Adrian, I completely agree. It's not movement across space that's interesting, it's movement across states, a space that is charged politically by prevailing structures. So it's a friendly challenge, you know, do you really want to blow this thing up and you know, throw your lot in with one sort of wing of migration studies, or can there be a sort of middle ground where we build on some of those key insights, especially Zolberg's insights, while still being very keen on criticizing and basing our criticism on an understanding of prevailing structures? Thanks.
I think we should continue to take comments. We've got quite a variety of different sorts of points of view in the audience, I think, and it would be nice to hear your thoughts on you know, what I and Anne have kind of laid out here, I think, first. So I'm I mean, it sounds like maybe the audience wants me to say something more to keep the discussion rolling from these initial comments. I mean, Phil, I think Phil, when you read the paper, I think you'll find that it is consistent with the way in which you present Ari's position, as Anne was saying. I mean, it's by no means dissolving the power of the Westphalian nation state and its traditional. I'm really wanting to emphasize that as a structuring power in the world, and the power of immigration as such at the core of it as the key issue. But we have to think about these, I think, more seriously about the relationship between of things that get blown up into the symbolic politics of immigration and the things that we think of as banal, such as me coming to the US yesterday. For me, that's always been at the heart of my interest in middling and so-called elite migrations and so forth, because there's a reason why we can move and other people can't, obviously, and the relationship between migration and free movement and other sorts of forms, which we may see returning. I mean, I think that's an open question too. What is going to happen to these mobilities after the COVID shock, but and the effects of the pandemic. With Anne's Anne and I have, there's obviously a very clear relationship between the work we're doing, and it's exciting to be part of a kind of back and forth that's now run through a couple of publications, and I think I hope that this will be very generative in a much broader sense. The business that I'm involved in is a very hugely synthetic business, and a lot of the things you're pointing out, obviously I'm trying to kind of juggle them and bring together the Misadras and Digenevers of this world with the Zolbergs and the Brubakers, which I think for some people is an odd thing to be doing. My strong sense in the younger generation, if you look at something like the Mablin and Turner recent book on decolonizing migration studies, there's zero references to the old guys. It's like it's gone. They're in a different world of references altogether, of the ones I point out. The kind of decolonial, critical race type references. These things have to be brought into conversation, and that's the one thing I try to do with this paper. That is particularly quixotic exercise, perhaps, and I think your comments really do help open these out. I think you're probably right about the limitations of Achume's work. It does seem to fold in the end into this kind of defense of the one-way citizenship solution. I think Shakar's work also, her recent book on shifting the border, in the end defends a kind of citizenship model. Everybody wants there to be a win-win-win at the end of the day, and what I'm really saying is there has to be a win-win-lose, and the losers have to be us. We have to lose from all of this if there's going to be any shift in global inequalities, and that's where I think the power of potentially disintegrative politics of migration comes in. The disintegrative processes of the state. I think we have to be careful that disintegration here it's not really disintegration in the sense that it's enabling various sorts of embeddedness of state forms of the kind that you identify, the offshore solutions and so forth to population management. The key thing for me is the fact that the symbolic power of integration gets projected onto immigrants integrating as a way of facilitating the free movement of others. And this particular sort of dual action is, I think, at the core of why it creates a certain sort of neoliberal, very functional kind of neoliberal and highly racialized kind of solution to a mobile planet, but nevertheless has strongly anchored Westphalian national forms and state sovereignty. That to me is key. I'm very interested in the stuff, obviously, that the state finds difficult to make legible. There's a strong influence of James Scott's work in what I do, and it's that kind of stuff, I think, that is interesting about a lot of ongoing forms of transnationalism, if we can call it that still. When they are linked perhaps to the messing up of citizenship, of immigration, of migration management, and of the kind of tidy kind of discourse of migration and development that has fallen apart, I guess, in the last 10 years or so. I would want to signal, I think, the importance of Syed's work as well. I mean, Abdel Malak Syed's work. Integration really starts it doesn't start, when immigrants arrive in the receiving state. It starts at the other end, as it were, with a particular sort of way in which the economic relations are being constructed in the colonial scenario, and how that plays out. And the suggestion that could become somehow reversed, I think, is very important to my argument. And it'd be really great, this kind of audience and the interest here, with all the Latin American specialism and so forth. The arguments about indigenous forms. I think what's really important here is, of course, the political demography of standard modernization, state building, citizenship, as we understand it, is also a particular kind of political ecology, which of course cuts across indigeneity in some sort of wet sense. It's something that excludes indigeneity or marginalizes it inherently in order to build a kind of modern state-centered citizenry population, in which indigeneity gets processed into, well, indigeneity, the original natives, as it were, of a particular place, get replaced by the newcomers who become the new natives and the new mainstream, and the indigenous become a minority, managed in various ways in relation to majorities and so forth, and subsumed into the dynamics of race and ethnicity that get carved out of the legacies of slavery and race, the race color line, and or immigrant ethnic diversity, which is something I really spent a lot of time in the Integration Nation trying to lay out a framework for, because I think the really key point here is the relationship between the dissolving of the dissolving of race issues into a perspective that emphasizes diversity and ethnicity and a certain sort of process towards integration, the impossibility of dissolving that race line, and the reason why certain sorts of politics still get thrown up around race politics as such, which makes everybody uncomfortable because we're always wanting to move towards a post-race kind of world in the standard liberal democratic narrative. And I think that indigeneity plays into that very substantially in the way that I just sort of suggested, the political ecology kind of dynamic that maybe lays at the base of this. I need to think more about this, and I do take this as a key contribution of the things you've been writing, and so the book is a manifesto. The article is a synthesis and a manifesto. There's a huge project here that needs writing systematically to really kind of get at these big pictures, the big picture. But I'm glad very much that you recognise the value, at least, of insisting upon the power of the resilience of mainstream conceptions of immigration, integration, and citizenship in radical circles, anti-race circles. People talk as if this stuff doesn't exist anymore, as if it's been washed away by critical thinking. But the reality is integration research funded by policymakers with this standard mainstream, what is essentially an assimilation project, which we call integration, is the standard model, and it is the standard normal science that's being churned out by lots of very mainstream scholars, not only in migration studies now, but all kinds of social scientists who just simply accept the linear narrative of immigration, integration, citizenship, the progressive idea of immigrant integration as a form of equality that will achieve a post-race diverse society, which everyone's happily integrated, presumably, and that's, you know, that's what's being reproduced. It's being reproduced. I think that the most obvious integration nation now in Europe, the ascendant integration nation, is Germany. After 1.3 million refugees arrived, the amount of money being poured into integration research by the EU and by Germany is phenomenal, and it's very interesting to see how, you know, there's a whole series of critical scholars involved in this research who juggle the awkward kind of tension between, you know, the mainstream language that policymakers want and, you know, the critical impulse of anti-racism and the legacy of post-colonialism that's still there and bubbling around and has come back with Black Lives Matter, but which cannot be called that, you know, very openly in open policy research, you know, because we can't call it multiculturalism anymore, because that was destroyed by both academics and policymakers at a certain point. We try calling it interculturalism, but that's really, you know, just another euphemism for the same kind of integration kind of process. And yeah, I think we, you know, we struggle to come up with performative kinds of languages that are not co-opted all the time by mainstream progressive thought, and you know, that's also at the heart of what I'm doing, which is an attempt to try and spell out the conditions in terms of an autonomous critical migration studies that is not subject to these kinds of pressures that have been imposed upon us by, you know, the policy debates.
Yeah, Ross?
Is that me?
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Adrian, and thank you, Anne. So I've learned a lot from the paper, and Adrian, particularly your comments now. The question I want to raise is one of actual politics, and I want to raise it in this kind of way. The critique of the integration model is incredibly powerful, but given the existing structure of power, it's almost impossible to avoid that model in debates about treatment of refugees, migrants, things like this. In other words, within the United States, the other countries, the model is, as it were, imposed on activists. And I was particularly interested in, Adrian, your comments toward the end of your paper, and Anne's comments about challenging this model in actual politics, but how did it actually work? In other words, that somehow the model that you've been criticizing is almost unavoidable for activists, for people working. They've got to persuade, work within the existing structures, and the existing structures include borders, include the state with the power to determine who comes in and who comes out. Democratic, quasi-democratic policy, some notion of democratic politics, so people have to be persuaded. How does that work? What kind of politics is required here?
I mean, what I would say is that there's an insistence that I want to stress upon the need for constant reflection on what the impact of a migration to a particular country has been on the sending state. This seemed to be obvious, I guess, in many senses that there's always a two sides to the story, but I think there's a very strong tendency in the current kind of dynamic with integration to kind of say, well, the best case scenario effectively is that we take in some migrants by whatever criteria, we still are able to take in certain migrants selectively, and we do our best with them by integrating them, and that's a positive in some sense. And what I'm saying is, well, no, it isn't if it simply reinforces the global inequality hierarchy in terms of values of citizenship. So it forces us back, which is the point from Syed to continually kind of work with those effects on the sending society, whether they're political or economic, or undermining borders or undermining our own kind of hallowed institutions and so forth, which was, I think, an early a key point of all of the early transnationalism. It was transformative in this way, and the big disappointment with the transnationalism literature is it just kind of gave up on this and started trying to say, well, no, transnationalism is compatible with integration and so on. Well, no, it has to be transformative of the global hierarchy. I think where the politics is positive is that even migrants who've been lucky and been through this sort of process, in some of the cases of recent, the recent sort of refugee migration, would be they're the first to recognize, of course, as migrants, that their lives are still heavily embedded in the place that they've left, even if they can't go back. They're still embedded in the politics and the economics of those places because they have family and friends, and society for them is partly located there. And this is the continual resource, obviously, of migration, that it generates this kind of politics. And we're constantly in this game, I think, on the receiving side of trying to celebrate immigration, which then gets turned always into this kind of integration as a branding device that then eventually sustains a certain sort of positive vision of the nation, which is the French football team that I showed you, or all kinds of things I could show you from the UK, in terms of how it brands itself through immigration. The politics, yeah, I think is it has to lie there, and it has to lie in that sort of discussion. I'm saying, we're also in a position now, I think, to assess a lot of the disappointments of the 1990s and 2000s in terms of migration and development, transnationalism, and the kind of cosmopolitan post-national order and so forth that was just over the horizon. And I think we have to be very careful, obviously, then in looking at the decolonial agenda, which is now there, and seeing how well it really kind of breaks free of some of the faults that previous literature had. I would also say, that the other thing that I'm very insistent upon is that we should expect there to be conflict around these issues. I mean, and I also think we can call, that it makes a difference whether you call it integration or you call it anti-racism. It actually makes a difference if you call it multiculturalism as opposed to integration. And I think that the resurgence of a more obvious post-colonial anti-racist type of politics, pushing back on some of these issues in activist spaces and in outside of the kind of integration framework is a positive sign. I think there's been a lot of that happening, and I think it's worth stressing all of that, I think, as a key point. And for me, it's obviously no surprise perhaps that we're all reading Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy again, because this was kind of there 20, 30 years ago, and it's still highly relevant, I think. I think any kind of politics, and I'll finish with this point, that the point with Gilroy, of course, is that the politics of blackness, the kind of what was a post-national kind of politics as well that he and Hall were trying to articulate, existed very closely in relation to the nationalist post-colonial melancholy that they obviously identified as the mainstream our our society in the UK case. Well, as you'll see if you take a look at the book, I mean, I think Brexit just laid all of this open very clearly for us to observe, the pathologies of Brexit and how it happened and why it happened in terms of immigration and race, and the anti-European kind of movement, reveal, I think, that kind of politics on, in a negative dynamic. But I think, that the alternate politics that it's thrown up have also been interesting, I think, around the Windrush scandal and other things. So, it's not a wholly pessimistic vision, certainly. And I think there are lots of resources out there in terms of what critical academics tend to focus on. It tends to emphasize a lot of these ongoing politics, I think.
Yes, Alex?
Hi, Adrian. Nice to see you.
Hi.
I really like this project, and I really like the paper. I look forward to seeing the book. I want to pick up on something that Phil said. I get your sense it's a little bit to the side of what you're saying, but it's consistent with Anne in terms of trying to push out the boundaries a bit, her discussion of indigeneity. So Phil said something like, it's not the moving that's interesting, it's the moving across borders, essentially. I'm not saying that was his view, but I think he wasn't quite attributing that to Zolberg, but making the point that it's the political movement across borders that gets things going. And I'm wondering whether migration studies should really be much more concerned about internal movement. And it doesn't have to collapse into just mobility, but I'm thinking here about a lot of things. So first of all, on the forced migration side, we talk about the category of forced migrants. And in that literature now, it clearly includes internally displaced people as much as refugees. And people say, why do we take these few refugees and we have so many forced, internally displaced people who are forced from their homes for similar kinds of reasons? And it's taken on particular importance now with the climate movement, because almost all of the climate movement, tens of millions of people moving, almost all of them will stay inside their countries. And shouldn't migration studies be interested in that kind of movement, which doesn't cross a border? I'm also thinking about African-American history in the United States. You can sort of, a really interesting story to tell about forced movement into the country because of slavery, enslavement. But then the Great Migration North of 6 million African Americans to the north, or even going back the fugitive slave laws in the United States, which allowed people to capture people and bring them back to the South, and the slave codes regulation of mobility. So there are really interesting stories to be told about restrictions, race-based and others, on mobility, or even the Dust Bowl movement in the United States of people from Oklahoma moving to California, and Supreme Court decisions saying that, no, we're one nation and you have free movement. So anyway, so the question then is, should migration studies be thinking more seriously about internal movement, and not just because it's movement and mobility, but because it actually has some very important implications. The second point is, it goes to your slide when you threw in COVID at the bottom, at the last line, well, does COVID change? I'm thinking of recent stuff that Audrey Macklin, I'm not sure he's published yet, but is writing, I've heard her talk about it, that what COVID showed was what we thought citizens had, the sort of freedom of movement, and something that immigrants didn't have, non-citizens didn't have. But we pretty quickly learned we don't have it, and that there is no right to movement, that there is permission to move, that states have been usually pretty willing to grant citizens, but very surprisingly disappeared overnight in the middle of March 2020. It just disappeared for most of us, or many of us. So those are just two different sort of random thoughts on, but not to the heart of the project, but I really like the project and want to read more.
I wonder if Anne might like to comment any more on these sorts of thoughts. I mean, I feel that they, fit very much with the kind of framework that I'm proposing. So, obviously the idea is that there is this huge continuum of movements, both inside and beyond states. And I'm interested in the peculiar fact that we still focus on tens of thousands of officially designated migrants as a kind of problematic of immigration politics in our receiving state, as opposed to understanding, how it is that all of these other populations either get to move or don't get to move. And the COVID point makes my point again of obviously revealing just how structured by particular sorts of state designated possibilities free movement obviously was as well. And and I think will that be coming back? Is I think the interesting question. I think it's coming back in a way that will still exist, but will have these new sorts of modes of control and accreditation, and a different sort of biometric kind of way of maybe enabling those sorts of quote unquote free movements to be able to happen. But yes, certainly, the internally displaced persons argument and so forth. I mean, I think we need somehow. I think the project needs to start off with a big panorama, of international migration as we know it today. As it's understood in the kind of general sense of scholarship and policy understandings of international migration, and then I can maybe kind of home in on this particular problematic that identify as the perspective still very much from the receiving state side, and its attempts to I suppose use immigration as the ongoing way of sustaining a certain sort of notion of citizenship at a time when these things have almost dissolved in a broader sense.
Maybe I can add a couple of things. I think I can maybe say something about Alex's point about internal migration and in particular the African American experience by starting off actually just in relation to Ross's question on what this looks like politically on the ground, what these sorts of critiques look like politically on the ground. Because I guess for me, a lot of my thinking on this comes from the politics on the ground rather than from an abstract theorization. And so, I think obviously the kinds of, strategies to, using the legal systems we have, the kinds of forms of migration status we have, the political claim for asylum and so on, that it's not that, this sort of suggests one ought not pursue that route. That's obviously an existential necessity for many people, and it's a key way of mobilizing around some of these issues. But I think it's a point of emphasis, right? So by contrast with that kind of legal strategy, if you think at what some of the organizing say in the Mediterranean context, I'm thinking of the group that many of you would know, the Alarm Phone group, that does a lot of the rescue operations, or at least communicates and puts migrant vessels in touch with rescuers and so on. They very deliberately and publicly don't use the language of asylum seekers, of refugees, but just of migrants, right? And not even sort of that word necessarily. And the way they sort of describe what they do is very much a project that entails people called migrants and people called citizens, and sort of much less the kind of person in need, the person who is claiming or making a particular claim for asylum, but someone who sort of autonomously decides to move, right? And the sort of circulation on social media of sort of shared shared tactics, right? How did you move across the border, regardless of legality? And that kind of public distribution of a kind of entitlement to move regardless of the law. So it's a different kind of emphasis, even though there's nothing in that activist group that would sort of stand in the way of someone claiming asylum through that process. And I think the other dimension of that is then working then in solidarity with, for instance, domestic anti-racist organising of the kind that's sort of very mobilised in the US context around Black Lives Matter, but obviously not just in the US, to start to kind of interrogate, to Alex's point, the forms of forced movement, the forms of compelled immobilities, right? Whether it's people in the global south or people who are incarcerated, or people, coming back to the indigeneity question, people who have been forcibly removed and so on, and to try and interrogate the kinds of conditions under which people are mobile or immobilized, historically as much in the present, as part of, the same kind of global systems. So putting those kinds of situations in conversation with each other and analytically as much as politically, I think is something that is happening very much on the ground in terms of activism around this. And it's that process that I think is informing this kind of theoretical push to sort of name those things and sort of talk about them in the critical scholarship.
Yes, Diana.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation and comments, Adrian Favell, and also for the comments on the paper. I've been thinking about it all, and I think following up on Anne's comment just now, one thing that I was wondering when I read the paper was about when you talk about this disintegrative politics, and you mentioned the autonomy of migration and active citizenship as sort of alternatives to what you call this march of liberal progress, or what in Anne's work could be seen as the idea of progressive time. As you mentioned those two particular frames, autonomy of migration and active citizenship, as alternatives to that, I was just wondering more empirically, perhaps in your book, how you analyze that, how you explore it, what sort of more, in the European context, how they more strategically manage to interrupt those assumptions, from migration to integration and citizenship. I was just curious to hear basically how you deploy those ideas or those frames to show cracks in that model of the march of liberal progress and the model of integration and citizenship and so on. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so yeah, to some extent, the book book does not extend that much further than the article on these kinds of issues. I give some sort of suggestive examples. I think what I'm wanting to do is tie into what is an existing large literature, I think, on autonomy of migration and active citizenship, that it has lots of examples in some ways, but showing how I think it can be related to as I suggested, first of all, a kind of a critical real evaluation of the transnationalism literature, and then in one chapter, and then a closing chapter which looks at the theoretical framing of decolonization, as the kind of, as it were, latest latest set of resources that have appeared for for scholars. So, you know, a good example, I think, would be the work that Chala and Glick-Schiller, their work on placemaking and migration politics in peripheral cities, which is of interest to us because you know, what we're doing also in the UK about very peripheral locations in the north of England, which are the, you know, the epicenter in some sense of this kind of supposedly, you know, white working class backlash type politics. But you know, when they, as we do, you know, go in on the ground into certain sorts of places where you have this kind of complicated mix of new migrants, post-colonial nationals, and you know, an older race politics around that, that's overlaid with a new kind of you know, new migrant politics that's also, you know, partly around white migrants as well as you know, asylum seeker migrants. That there are some, nevertheless, some very interesting sorts of collective mobilizations in these contexts that even in some sense, you know, in some cases, you know, linking with the peripheral politics of the cities themselves, are pushing towards a certain sort of disintegrative national effect in a way. You know, they're kind of pulling away from national politics and enabling an alternate sort of, you know, a new kind of transnational politics in some sense to emerge in these very peripheral locations that are not the, you know, the typical locations such as the global cities. So, you know, that's the sort of work that I've been involved in on the ground, as it were, that I think has a relevance here. And you know, I think Chala and Glick's book is a, you know, rare example in some ways of that sort of dynamic. You know, that'd be the kind of thing I'd be looking for. You know, and this is in a context, you know, in a British context, let's say, where you have a very powerful reaffirmation of the integration nation. You know, there's been an interesting dynamic of the UK using a certain sort of anti-immigration politics that was actually linked to the critique of free movement of EU citizens to effect an exit from the EU, which then gets quickly shifted into a new politics of national empire building that is, you know, very much around a certain sort of, you know, again, a kind of nationally branded multiracial notion of integration that at the same time also enables a particular sort of smothering of the multinational fractures that actually are a reality in the context of, you know, so-called United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, where you've got you know, very strong denational, you know, disintegrative politics being pursued in Scotland, for example, you know, with its own kind of different line on notions of the nation, notions of race and migration. So you know, each case has to be looked at in those kinds of national contexts, I think. But I'm offering a framework and a synthesis that I think is unusual in trying to bring together perhaps work that's very obviously done certain things in a critical register, such as Mazadra and Disintegrative, back with things that have you know, that have been done 20, 30 years ago, but which I think can be looked at again in the light of the new critical theories.
Yes, Carlos?
We can't hear you, Carlos.
This isn't exactly my area of study, so, and I don't want to say more than I actually know, but I come at it from a slightly different perspective, because I'm interested really in, currently the work has to do with Quechua, Aymara, and Guarani-speaking documented and undocumented Bolivians in Argentina. So it's a part of the world that oftentimes is off the grid. But in hearing you present your work and hearing the comments that Anne and the other members of the audience made, it seems to me that migration studies, really like any academic discipline, has to draw its boundaries so that there's an object of study. And in the way you draw them and in the way you describe the field, there seems to be, there's on the one hand, the liberal nationalists, they draw the boundaries in such a way so that the object of study becomes immigration, integration, and citizenship. And then the Marxian Foucauldian ones draw it in such a way so that the object becomes boundary making, governmentality, and racialization. And you present them as if they're in many ways diametrically opposed or against each other. And I see them as actually quite complementary and not terribly, if the point, as I think you're trying to make here, if the point is to define a new object of study, one that will be disintegrative, I think of the two of them as actually buttressing integration, and also in the following way. I think both of them begin with the premise that what you need to study is what's going on primarily in border areas and the movement. And it seems to me that what an alternative way of doing this may be to look at a more lateral or horizontal processes of a long term, in which, how it is that peoples that second or third generation, like in England, Caribbean Blacks, they've been there, they're not migrants, they're nationals. And yet, given the way these two approaches, the liberal nationalists and the Marxian Foucauldians are framing it, they would not be, I don't think, strictly speaking, they wouldn't be part of the object of study. Why not explore how these groups are denormalizing societies, how they are also desubjectivizing themselves and rights-bearing citizens. And in doing that, they're actually disintegrating the possibilities or disintegrating relations between racialized peoples and non-racialized peoples, which is exactly what Black Lives Matter did. It was the first time that these movements, society-wide, demanded for the first time the rights to have rights, and it convinced for the first time a great many rights-bearing white people that, yes, this is right. And this came not only in the US with Black Lives Matter, but it's happened with Muslims in a bunch of places. It's happened with indigenous peoples in a whole bunch of places. And these kinds of phenomena, as far as I can tell, but again, perhaps I'm being impertinent because I'm not in this field, but it seems to me that these kinds of phenomena are left out. They're omitted from the object of study in the way currently the field of migration studies constructs its objects.
No, this is absolutely right. I mean, and this is the what you're doing is laying bare, as in some sense I'm doing, is the pathologies of the field of migration studies in relation to what we might be saying if we looked at it through critical race studies. And there are certain critiques of that kind that I sort of bring to bear in my discussion. I think what's missing perhaps is that the fact, if you're talking about the UK and you're talking about established race, racially recognized minority groups, British groups, Black British groups, Asian British groups that are, as you say, long-term in British societies and should not be seen through a migration studies lens. What's of course politically interesting is how they have become immigrants again, whereas 20, 30 years ago, they were not seen as immigrants. The immigration integration paradigm has risen, partly on the back of new migrations and on an emergence of a particular sort of way of looking at migration studies. And has transformed in some sense those groups back into groups that are seen within a kind of migration framework. And I think it's important to try and understand what the historical politics around that have been, and how that happened, and how that, for example, absolutely channeled into Brexit. Brexit and the Windrush scandal at the same time were the evidence of exactly just how potent that particular kind of political redefinition could be. And there's a long story about how anti-racism and how anti-racism multiculturalism gets transformed into a anti-immigration or an immigration politics that is either anti-immigration, or the progressive side is integration, with a certain sort of celebratory kind of language around it. Immigrants make Britain great is the kind of way this gets branded by influential minority figures in Britain who kind of play into the colonial logic that's at stake here. So, I think what you're saying is absolutely right, but there's interesting things that have gone on in this kind of and a whole kind of account which I try to give in the book of the relationship between migration studies and what used to be seen as ethnic and racial studies in the UK and the US, and the relationship between these two things, which I think needs to be brought back into focus. The two sides. I also want to say that the particular example you sent me about Bolivian migrants in Argentina, and your use of Balibar, which I think is also very influential on my work, is absolutely relevant to what we're doing here. So Argentina perhaps also is a nation that might flirt with a kind of immigrant integration nation type of model, within this kind of international perspective, imposing linear types of conceptions on these, what we might have called transnational migrant groups that are operating in a different sort of space, that have these indigenous politics or not, and that have a relationship to the sending society that works in a completely different way to the way in which the national kind of immigration focus maybe gets to look at them. And I felt the kind of terms that you were setting up in the study of Bolivians in Argentina would fit very well as an example in a different context of the kind of dynamics that I identify more typically in Western Europe. But so I find all of that very very helpful to the general project that I'm engaged in.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if we were to displace the focus on the issue of borders and migration movement, and we start looking really at laterally the entire process. I mean, Ecuador just a few days ago, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of indigenous groups, saying that the state could not go into these communities and take subsoil resources from them because it belongs to them. Now, these are not migrants. These are, they've been there longer than any settler, colonial settler. So, I mean, again, I'm not in the field, but I'm wondering if we took all these cases that are left out of the field and assembled them, brought them together, whether we wouldn't be seeing other things. The Mexicans now that are, I mean, it used to be that the Mexican-US border was horizontal with the Rio Grande dividing the two countries, basically, and it had to do with the Bracero program. And now the borders in that area is really a corridor that goes from Central America to Chicago. So it's shifted from horizontal to vertical, and that was done by migrants. And you can't figure that out given the current ways of framing these problems. And the border has changed partly because the migrants are, there are these caravans that continuously are moving up north. and they're actually redefining what is the geopolitical borders between Mexico and Central and North America, or Central America and North America. And I don't see the way the field is currently framing the debates. I mean, de Genova and Mesadra's work, even that one doesn't quite get at what's going on there.
No, but there's going to be a relationship between the, the effects of this caravan, or, a kind of lateral territorial space that you say spans across borders, and attempts within American politics to redefine, renationalize the border and so forth, and come up with new ways of control, new ways of categorizing migrants and mobilities that have to take place, or that will take place across the borders. I mean, I think that's one thing I would say. And another thing is, I think there are really interesting things to be thought through in terms of, obviously, imperial formations beyond the nation state. And this is the partly what the Chumier is also pointing towards, that these nations, the nations do extend in some ways beyond this, and an attempt to encompass to some extent the deterritorialized aspects of some of the groups and so forth that constitute them. I'd also, I want to suggest that the core of what we should be studying also is the relationship between how different sorts of migrant groups are categorized in a receiving state context, to how ethnic and racial groups are categorized, and how indigenous groups are categorized, and how all of those things are managed and put together is, I think, the interesting kind of conundrum that has really not been solved by the field, because the field tends to look, from a migration studies point of view, it's all relatively easy if you can turn your groups into foreign, if the ethnicity, as it's called in standard in immigration research in the US, is attached to a kind of foreign nationality, and the foreign nationality has certain sorts of cultural or racial characteristics, and then you can kind of measure to the degree to which it disappears or doesn't into some sort of receiving context. That kind of works in a flattening process, but what's really striking, I think, about the kinds of nations I'm talking about, which are relatively similar and present themselves as having immigration integration policies, is they still have very, very different ways of categorizing their migrants and minorities and indigenous populations where they exist, in a way that is quite confusing and difficult to get around in terms of the political demography at stake there. So the differences between the US, Canada, France, Britain, Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands on these issues is quite vast. Every one of them has a different way of looking at how you categorize these populations. And that's very specific to each national state context, and the power that's generated in a post-colonial context, et cetera, I mean, out of these ways of managing these issues. But yeah, I would hope at least that I would be able to suggest frameworks that can encompass or speak meaningfully to Latin American cases as much as the cases I'm building centrally around, because I think that I think Latin American nations have been subject to the influence of the American empire of immigration and integration thinking in the same way that Western Europe has, because it's a global model that's out there. Go look at MIPEX if you're puzzled. I mean, the migration policy index is a wonderful example of this. It's a Brussels-based organization that's cranking out integration models for the world, and based roughly on a sort of an idealization of Canada/the US in a sort of interesting way. It's obviously not the reality. It's not the reality of the US or the reality of Canada, but an idealization of these places as kind of integration nations.
Yeah, I already ordered your book, but Amazon won't deliver it for another, I think it's 10 days or so.
No, it's almost there, I think, in their warehouse. So Jose, you need to
Yeah.
instruct us. How long do we go for? I'm not sure.
Any last comment or thought? So if no one jump in, thank you so much for register and your participation in tonight's event.